Now that you understand the basic relationships, let's tinker around. So we've decided that an article belongs to a user, and a user has many articles. But in order to make that work, we need some association between the article and the user. So it stands to reason that we need a new user ID column. All right, I will return to our create articles table migration, and we'll add a new section here. This will be an unsigned big integer, and we're going to reference the user ID. So now we have a way to associate one article with a user. And actually, real quick, if you're curious about unsigned big integer, by default, with the Laravel migrations, the primary key will be set to a big integer. So here's the users table migration that comes with every Laravel install. Here it's set to big increments. That's an unsigned primary key with a type of a big integer. So when we set our foreign keys, we want to make sure that they match up. So the foreign key also is of the type big integer. Okay, so now I'm going to rerun our migrations. And if I switch back to Table Plus, we have lost our data if I refresh, but we now have a user ID column. Okay, so often when you're tinkering around like this, it's useful to have dummy data. So for example, a way to say, quickly give me a user, or quickly give me an article. And it's not only useful for manual testing, but you can also reference this for your automated testing that we'll talk about near the end of the series. So if I open up the sidebar in the database folder, you'll see this new one, factories. And out of the box, we have a user factory. Think of this as a way to quickly scaffold basic users. So we can see here, if we need a user, we have to provide a name, an email verified at, a dummy password, and a token. And you'll notice we're pulling in this Faker library that allows us to quickly generate any form of dummy data. A name, a paragraph, a word, a number of words, an email, a safe email. There's hundreds of different choices. It's very useful in situations where you don't care what the value is. You just want a paragraph or a name or an email or an address. Okay, so anyways, we have this factory out of the box. We can use it like so. We boot up PHP Artisan Tinker, and we're going to call a helper function named factory. I want to quickly create a factory for a user. So we give the path to the user, and we call create. All right, factory function, you give the class name, and then you call create. So what this will do is trigger this function. It'll generate a unique set of dummy data, and then it will persist it. So now if I come back to Table Plus and I refresh, we have a new user. Let's do it again. And now we have 2 users. Or let's say we want 5 different users. I can provide the count as the second argument to the factory function. All right, now I should have a total of 7 users. So don't forget about this. It's really useful during the testing, tinkering phase. Okay, the next step though, I want an article. And if I try to run this, like if I say, well, whip up an article for me, it's not going to work. And that's because we don't have an article factory. There's nothing in there. All right, let's make one. PHP Artisan. And if I go up to the make section, you'll see there is an option to make a factory. So I could say, well, first, if you don't know what you can pass to it, always run the help command. All right, so we give it options as well as a name, and the name is the name of the class. But also notice we can give it an M flag as well to reference the model. Let's make a new factory, and we're going to call it article factory. That's the convention. And you'll now see that here. However, notice it's not referencing a specific model. So in user factory, we are creating a new definition. Basically, we're defining a factory for user. But here it's still the parent model class. And that's because it doesn't know what model we are working with. So that's where the M flag comes in. I can say app article. Okay, so now we'll see it is referencing the article there. Okay, so the next step is, what's the basic blueprint for an article? And we can just refer to the structure here. We want to give it a user ID, a title, an excerpt, and a body, and the timestamps are auto-populated, so we can ignore those. Okay, so let's see. User ID, that'll be something. The title, the excerpt, and then finally the body. All right, let's do the easy ones first. The title will be a sentence. So why don't we just say, Faker, give me a sentence. Next, an excerpt. You know what? Let's just do the exact same thing. We could do a sentence, or we could ask for a paragraph. The body will be a longer form, presumably, so I could call paragraph or multiple paragraphs. Let's just stick with one, though. Finally, the user ID. So this is a little bit more tricky. We don't want to hard code something like this. Well, I mean, you can if you want, but now we have an article that points to a user that doesn't exist. So in these cases, we can reference a different factory. I could say user ID. Well, I'm going to need a user who created this article, right? So let's say, all right, build up an article like so. So now when I create a factory for an article, it'll give me fake data here, and then it'll look at the user ID. Oh, we need to build up a user. So it will call this factory, and then it will return the primary key and set it as the user ID here. All right, so let's give it another shot. I boot up PHP Artisan Tinker. I run that command one more time, and there we go. We now have 5 articles, and notice that for each one, we also generated a new user and associated it with that article. So if I come back and we take a look at the data here, there we go. 5 articles written by 5 different users. So we should now have some additional users here. However, there will be times when, for example, you want to create an article, but associate it with an existing user. So when you call the create method, you can provide any attribute overrides. So for example, I could say override the title. And now when we run this, we'll have 5 new articles, but with the title equal to what we passed there. So come back, refresh, and there's the 5 new articles. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete those as well as those users we created, and then Command S to persist. More likely what you'll want to do is create an article, but associate it with an existing user. So let's say I want the user ID for these 5 articles to be, how about this first one, Miss Retta Haley. All right, set it to 1. And now we have 5 new articles, all of which are associated with her. But now we do have another problem. And this is basic database SQL 101. We have Miss Retta Haley, and she has written 5 articles. But let's just go ahead and delete her. Command S to persist, and it allowed it. So now we have these orphans. We have 5 different articles that were written by a user who does not exist. And you want to be careful about this. We don't want our database in such a fragile state. So let's make some tweaks. Once again, I'm going to go back to our articles table migration. It sounds like this should have a constraint. So I could say table, the foreign key called user ID. In fact, that references the ID column on the users table. And let's say if we happen to delete that user, we should cascade and delete all of the associated articles. So this is Laravel's blueprint syntax for declaring a foreign key constraint with SQL. Okay, so one more time, I'm going to run migrate fresh. That'll drop all the tables and rerun them. But now, yeah, if I come back and refresh, so now you can see user ID is in fact our foreign key. We of course have the index that comes along with it, and you can review the specifics here. So let's try it out. I'm going to boot up PHP Artisan Tinker. I will whip up a user. Let's just do, actually, let's do 2 different users. All right, so we have Corrine and Loretta, and we'll find those here. Next, I'm going to do it again, but this time build a factory for an article. Let's do 5 articles, but I will override the user ID because we have existing users. So we want some with a user with an ID of 1. And then let's maybe do 3 more for the user with an ID of 2. Okay, so now if I switch back to the articles table, we have 8 different articles written by those 2 users. And we can see the link here, and that's because we set up the constraint. So here is the user with an ID of 1, or here is the user with an ID of 2. Anyways, now if we were to delete, how about Loretta? If I save it, it should now cascade and delete all associated articles. So let's give that a refresh, and now those are gone. So that's how we maintain integrity on the database end. So now that we have this relationship between a user and articles, we can put to use what we learned in the previous episode. So here's my user model. I'm going to fetch all articles written by that user, And as we learned, that is a has-many relationship. All right, let's give it a shot. PHP Artisan Tinker. Let's find the user with an ID of 1. All right, is Karine. We will, of course, you could save it like this and then say user articles. So again, notice, just to be clear, even though this is a method, when we want to access a relationship, or more importantly, access a record or a collection for that relationship, you call it as a property. Okay, so now we can see only the articles that were written by the user with the given ID, in this case, 1. Let's now do it in reverse. Let's find the article with an ID of 1. App article find 1. But this time I want to grab the user who wrote that article. So ideally we would do something like this, but that relationship isn't available. All right, let's go back to article. And right here, we'll set it up. User, and the inverse is a belongs to. If a user has many articles, then each article belongs to a user. All right, let's give it another shot. Run it again. Oh, and by the way, whenever you make a change to your code, it won't be reflected in the Tinker instance. So you will Control-C, and then usually I hit the up arrow key to rerun the previous command, like so. And there we go. The article with an ID of 1 was written by this user. Now, a quick note though, it is important to make sure that your terminology and the jargon you use matches up. So you might refer to the person who wrote an article as the author. In those situations, user may not be overly clear. If you want to say author though, it's not going to work. So once again, Control-C, up again. We try to grab the author, but this time you get null. And that's because Laravel and Eloquent will assume that you're following conventions. And in this case, it's because of the method name. So before, when it was called user, Laravel assumed, all right, the foreign key is probably called user ID on the articles table. However, once you changed it to author, it's now looking for author ID, and it doesn't match up. So in these situations, you can override or set the foreign key as the second argument, and you can review that here. Override the foreign key or stick with the default. All right, so let's give it another shot. PHP Artisan Tinker, we will track down the article with an ID of 1. All right, let's run it again, but this time grab the author of that article, and now it gives me the associated user. So yeah, things like this do in fact make a difference. As much as possible, you want to make sure that the code you write reflects the real way that you speak about the business. If you're having a conversation or a meeting, make sure that the terms and the jargon you use is reflected in the code you write. And in this case, granted, it's a very simple domain. It's an article, it's a blog. But still, if we are talking about an article's author, well, let's make sure that term is available in the code. All right, so we're making good progress. In this lesson, you learned how to update your migrations. You learned how to register foreign keys as well as foreign key constraints. You learned how to create database factories. And then you worked along as we wired up a has-many and belongs to relationship.